Hi, this is Sweet Life and I'm Natasha, back at it with the recipe for making Solara, also known as Rolli. Pretty much it's a pastry where you have sweetened bread on the outside that is filled with a sweet coconut filling on the inside that's typically dyed red. So when you cut into it, and it's called Rolli because it's rolled up, you see these swirls of coconut and the sweetened bread, and it makes for a really nice presentation. It's sweet, but not overly so. You can have it for breakfast, you can eat it as a snack, you can have it for dessert. It's just like a really nice treat that you generally find at Guyanese bakeries. So the first thing is we're going to start our dough with some flour. Typically you would use white flour, but I like to mix in whole wheat flour in pastries just because I find that it adds more flavor. And in this case here we have some whole wheat flour, but because we still want the bread to be nice and light and have a good texture to it, where whole wheat flour can sometimes be a little bit heavy, we're going to use a combination of the two flours. So we'll combine some whole wheat flour with some unbleached all-purpose flour so you get the benefits of both of them. To this, we're going to add some liquid. As in, it's bread, it's a flavored bread, so we wouldn't just add regular water. Instead, we're going to combine some brown sugar with salt and water to get the water to a point where it's sweet and savory. Not overly salty, not overly sweet, just the right combination of both. So this way, when you mix it into the flour and you then bake it into the bread itself is also going to have some good flavor to it. And from there, we're going to add a bit of butter to the flour and then also some yeast. And in this case, the yeast is just a regular packet of yeast. And to this, we added to a bit of water to activate the yeast, warm water, taking care that the water isn't too cold, but it's also not too hot because we don't want to kill the yeast. This we add into the flour, combine with the butter, give it a nice little mix. From here, basically what you do is you'll pour your yeast and water mixture into the middle of the flour and start blending the flour into it, right? As you go, bringing the flour in from the sides of the bowl and give it in a mix, you're then going to add the sugar and salt water mixture, right? But you want to start with the yeast and the water with the butter first so you can incorporate that because we want to make sure we get the full power of the yeast, and then as needed, we'll add in some of the other liquid. We want to make sure that the dough isn't too dry, but it's also not too wet. So we're not going to just dump all of that sugar, salt, water mixture into the flour. We're going to just add it gradually as we go along. So you want to take your time and incorporate the liquid into the dough. At this point, kneading it in the bowl, right? Not like taking out all your anger and aggression on it. You want to combine this where it goes from being separate ingredients to turning it into a nice smooth dough. And just take your time as you're going along, adding a little bit more liquid if you need it, adding a little bit of flour if you need it, but not dumping either in. One at a time because you want to give it some time to work together, but you want to balance the dough. You want to make sure that it's not like wet and gloopy or overly sticky, but at the same time, you don't want to overwork the dough. You don't want to add too much flour where it becomes tough and dry. So just enough of both, kind of a balancing act. So you get just the right amount of liquid, just the right amount of flour, kneading the dough together to turn it into a nice smooth dough. At which point the sides of the bowl should come clean because the dough will pull away from the side, right? It'll pull away from the bowl and start to stick to itself. It'll start to form into a dough. And really, we're just working this to be like a nice bread dough where we're going to then sit aside and let it rise. I recommend putting it somewhere in your kitchen that's not too drafty. It's perfectly fine if it's a little bit warm. You can also put it in the oven. Don't turn on the oven. But actually what you can do is, let's say you're making this during the winter and your house is maybe a little bit cooler. While you're mixing the dough together, turn your oven on to about 200 or so degrees and let it get just a little bit warm. After a few minutes, when the oven has warmed up, turn it off and you can put the dough in there, right? Just to give it a nice warm environment to rise. But we're not actually baking it at this point. It's just to get it warm so that it can rise. And you can also put if you put the bowl off to the side, you can cover the top of it with some plastic wrap or even a damp towel. So it's rising in a nice, warm, reasonably damp environment. That way it doesn't form that hard, crusty skin on the top of the dough. While the dough is rising, we're going to go ahead and start working on our filling. And as I said, it's a sweet and colored coconut filling. Save yourself some time. Don't bother trying to grate the coconut. The easiest thing to do is just to get shredded coconut from the store. You could use the sweetened or unsweetened kind. Just bear in mind, if you use the sweetened version, you're not going to add too much sugar to it because you don't want it to end up being overly sweet. Here I have some sweetened coconut. And to this, I'm just going to take this and put it into a pot. And add a bit of water because we're going to cook it, right? We want, like, when you get the coconut, it's shredded, it's dried, we want to rehydrate it a little bit. So we're going to add some water into it. We're going to add some other ingredients to up the flavor because on its own, dried coconut, especially if you get the unsweetened kind, it doesn't really have any flavor to it. So we have it in the pot, just going. We'll drop in a little bit of food coloring to give it that nice, bright, red, vibrant color. And we're just going to let it cook for a while, just to soften the coconut, to rehydrate it. And so after it's cooked for a while, we add some powdered ginger, sugar, a bit of vanilla, just to give it a start. So at this point, we've added a good amount of flavor to it. Our dough has been rising for a bit, and we're going to start to put our Solara together. Sprinkle a little bit of flour onto the dough and give it like a nice gentle knead. This is just to smooth out the dough a little bit more, and it's going to help with the texture. It's going to help to combine the dough together to get it to just the right texture and consistency. But now we're going to start putting the Solara together. If you think about it as like when you're making bread, you have like a whole big batch of bread dough, and you would just portion that off into smaller pieces so that you can, put together your loaves, your rolls, or whatever the case might be. In this case, we're going to cut this because we're making pretty much, if you think of it like loaves, but we're going to fill it. So we'll cut a few pieces and work with them one at a time. So cut the first piece, take it, put it on your countertop with just a little bit of flour so that the dough doesn't stick, but not too much where you're overloading it with flour. You want to put the dough down, start to flatten it, stretch it out a little bit, and you're going to need a rolling pin at this point. Think of it as if you're making pizza. You would actually want the dough to be even thinner than that. The reason being that when we roll this up, we're going to put it to rise again. So because you're going to have layers to this, you don't want the layers to be overly thick, right? If you think of this as like a jelly roll, you don't want the bread to be super thick and then you have this thin layer of coconut filling. You want it to be pretty balanced. So take your time to roll out the dough pretty thinly, but not to the point where you can see through it or it's getting holes or anything like that. Just thin enough where it can hold the filling in place, but not overly thick to the point where, it's out of balance with the coconut. Allow the coconut to cool for a little bit, while you're rolling out the dough. And we're going to use just a pot spoon to distribute the coconut filling over the dough. Again, if you think of it as like a pizza, where you've rolled out your dough and you would now be putting on your pizza sauce. But in this case here, we have this coconut filling. The reason that you don't want to work with the coconut being super hot is that, number one, it has sugar in it. You don't want to take the risk of it splattering all over the place, as well as the dough has butter in it, and we don't want the dough to become overly soft. So just let it go for a bit. It doesn't have to be ice cold, but just get some of that heat off of the coconut. Spread it evenly over the dough, leaving a reasonable border around the side so that the filling doesn't come spilling out. But you don't want like a huge border, right? Like in this case, we're not making a pizza. We don't want it to have that crust at the edges. And from there, be generous with the filling. You don't want to see the dough through the filling. You want to make sure that you have like a good amount of filling in each bite, but don't overfill it because when you roll this up, it has liquid in it and you don't want all of the liquid to just ooze out. You want to have balance. And now from there, you just finish off your loaves. Don't worry too much about the shape of it. You can do a loaf, you can do a U shape. It's really up to you. The reason you don't have to worry about the shape too much is that when this is done, we're going to slice it, right? You're not going to sit there and eat like the whole loaf. So don't stress too much about the shape or the size at this point. You don't want it to be overly wide because we want to be able to slice it where, maybe it's 2 inches or so wide and it's a good portion. It shouldn't be like a dinner plate size or anything like that. At the end, if you find that you still have some scraps of dough and some filling, you can make like hand pies where you roll out the dough, put some of the filling inside and just fold it over itself, crimping the edges. And once it's done, that's it. We just put it into the oven. Don't stress much if some of the liquid runs out, though I would recommend lining the bottom of your baking pan with foil because you might have some of the liquid running out. It'll have sugar in it. And if it gets to the bottom of the pan and burns, it'll stick on. It just helps to make cleanup easier. So put some foil at the bottom of the pan. That way, when you're done, you take the rollie off of the pan, and the foil you can just take and throw away. Being sure that you grease the pan or you grease the foil, whichever method you choose to use. Should you have a little bit of extra dough left over at the end and you run out of filling, you can just roll it into balls, make a little loaf of bread or a round of bread and put it into the oven with the rollie to bake. We are actually going to make a simple syrup. So it's going to be 2 parts sugar to 1 part liquid. You want it to be pretty thick. And when the Solara is just about done, you'll take it out of the oven, brush over the simple syrup, and then put it back in the oven. This way it'll caramelize. It's going to give the dough a nice color. It's going to give it a little bit of shine and shimmer and make it look even more appetizing. So this is just a really nice pastry that they make in Guyana. It'll make quite a bit with this recipe, and given the bread nature of it and being sweet, it goes well with a nice cup of tea. You can certainly have it with a cup of coffee. So with that, it's a nice option for breakfast, but you can also have it after dinner as dessert. It's not super heavy, it's not super sweet, and while I use some food coloring here, there are now some options for natural food colorings, or if you want, you can make your own. You can just also completely leave out the food coloring. Just bear in mind that with the coconut, it won't have like that bright, vibrant color. It'll taste the same, but it'll just look different.
Thanks for tuning in. To ensure you don't miss any episodes, subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and check out my Cooking at Home playlist. Go ahead and click that thumbs up button if you like what you saw, and go ahead and share it on social media.